Hi everyone, welcome back to the second session in the Hizmet Reads kind of discussion series, which will take a couple more weeks still, as we're taking our time with this book and going chapter by chapter. And of course, the book that we're reading is by Professor Paul Weller, who's here with us again this week. One of his latest books, one of two of his latest books, focus on Gülen, on the movement. And this one, of course, that we're looking through at the moment is called Fethullah Gülen's Teaching and Practice, Inheritance, Context, and Interactive Development. Welcome, Paul. Thank you for being here with us again to discuss.
Thank you. And I must apologize to everybody for my absence last week, which I won't pretend to cover up why. I simply, in the middle of moving my main residence here to Germany and unpacking the hundreds of books, as you can now see, I was living in a room with boxes all around my laptop, and I just completely forgot about it. So I really sincerely apologize, because people might have been waiting, and I'm sorry for that, but sometimes that happens in life.
Yeah. I mean, we're all human, and I mean, unpacking books is something that I'd get carried away with as well. So I have full sympathy.
Well, on top of it, one of the shelves fell down from the wall when I tried to fix it up, so that was the absolute disaster. But anyway,
I'm sure a lot of us would have sympathies with that entirely. So don't worry at all. I mean, thank you for being here to discuss the second chapter of the book. Anyway, I hope you're all kind of settled now, or at least better settled than last week. Is the bookshelf complete?
Yeah, it's kind of, there's lots of them. They're all around me, so I feel at home now. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, if you'd like, I can go straight into one of the first questions that I had. So, I mean, you start the section discussing the kind of wealth of literature. I mean, and sorry for those who don't know, the chapter is titled Person, Places, and Development, and it's kind of a review of the biographies, I would say. When I started reading the section, I had a quick glance over first, and then I thought it would kind of go in a chronological order because it was split in the cities or locations primarily, with the exception of the last section, which focused more so on Gülen as an enemy of the state. So I kind of thought it would go in a chronological order, and that would kind of be how the section would pan out. But I think it was a bit more complex than that, and I think there are a couple of reasons perhaps why, and you can perhaps explore that with us. But just on the wealth of the literature, I mean, you used some of the literature which you said was, objective, so-called kind of academic literature, and some other kind of literature in your review that was more poetic, like the works of Ansari, who as you quote as well, is more poetic and more perhaps looking at the spiritual dimensions of Gülen itself. Why did you think it was necessary to include both, and why did you decide to strike such a balance? I think because it is well proportioned, in my opinion.
Okay.
But decide to do that.
That's kind of you to say so. I mean, I think that decision ran in line with the overall principle about how I was approaching the project as a whole, and the books as a whole that we discussed a bit the last time. That is to say that to try to take into account kind of all perspectives and angles and different kinds of approaches, rather than necessarily privileging one kind over another to begin with. That's not to absolve the author, in this case myself, from making evaluative judgments, but it is to say that perhaps a richer picture can be developed by looking at different kinds of materials. I mean, I often say in academic work, we undervalue what I call ephemera, for example. Pamphlets, bits and pieces of paper, things that don't get kind of permanently published, but give an insight into a particular place, time, person, at least from the perspective of those who produce those things at that place and at that time. So I think they can all make a contribution. I mean, the Ansari book is in some ways quite a strange book to read because it seems it's kind of difficult to get hold of exactly, what is being said and why and how. But I thought nevertheless important to try to take some account of it. Of course, alongside those kinds of literatures was also the other set of sources, which was interviews with people who had been with Gülen from the early days. So there was, if you like, what I call the oral tradition in relation to that I also tried to bring into play. Now, as far as a kind of actual biographical thing, I mean, I think John Parr's work is excellent and reflects the approach of a historian in a proper sense. But like I say, I wanted to try and draw on these different kinds of sources, including the oral tradition, because that helps to paint a picture of a living person and not just a narrative out of pages, so to speak. And to me, that seemed to be an important thing to try to do in the book as a whole, actually, not just in this part. So I was concerned not simply to write, oh, this happened then and that happened then and that had an impact on such, but this is either the kind of person with whom one has to do in the subject matter of this book, and or this is how a range of people see and respond to this person. Yeah.
And I just had a quick question. Is the Ansari text a translation into English from the Arabic?
It is, yeah, if I recall correctly. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I was just kind of wondering, it just randomly popped into my mind now when I was reading some post-colonial texts and critiques earlier in the day, so that's probably why this has come to my mind. But
yes, I'd have to, somewhere on the shelf here, I haven't quite worked out where everything is yet, so I could just simply go, but I'm pretty sure it was. And of course, that also does reflect that different cultural approaches to people, to thought, to movements, etc., are important. And if one solely approaches the subject matter of this book from a kind of Western academic tradition perspective, then I think one's missing something in terms of kind of universal cultural richness. And there are different ways of starting and evaluating and of expressing, of course.
And yeah, I think
in translation, there's issues about how far that comes over, or how far. When I commented it's a strange book, perhaps that's partly because of a translation set of things, or my own lack of familiarity with Arabic cultures.
I mean, I was just thinking, perhaps the sort of Arabic way, or more so Islamic way of recalling history, although I mean Gülen is kind of recent history, is more poetic. I mean, perhaps that is just in the nature of that kind of cultural context and the knowledge which formed and presented in that context.
I mean, that's a very interesting observation, and I think there's probably quite a lot in another project I'm currently involved in, working on what we call resonance between Quran, Christian scriptures, and Tanakh, Old Testament, Hebrew scriptures. And of course, one of the very interesting things about that is that in both the Tanakh and the New Testament, the Christian Gospels and so on, one has a very straight linear narrative very often. So this and that happened in the year that so-and-so was king, and then, or Jesus went from such a place to another place, and then something else happened. And then you get a chunk of teaching that is in the place where it happened, and then it goes on again. And the narrative in the New Testament, of course, goes on from the birth of Jesus to the death of Jesus, then the affirmation of the resurrection of Jesus. In the Quran, at least as I understand it and perceive it, and I'm not an Arabic reader, so I miss out, I'm sure, on a lot, but even in translation, interpretation, one can see that it is not a chronological narrative. It doesn't act like that. And it's an interesting thing, why that should be. It feels, if I don't want to sound disrespectful if I say so, it feels more free-floating in a sense. And that's very interesting. And indeed, in our project, we've sometimes talked about this, that might it be that in different ways that scriptures can maybe complement each other, that there are aspects of what one might call the backstory of the Quran that one can find in the Tanakh and the Christian scriptures, because they're not, the narrative sequence is not foregrounded in the way that it is in the scriptures. So.
Yeah, no, I think I was reading another book, well, one of the books I'm reading in parallel to the many other books I'm reading at the moment, is on identifying the kind of major themes in the Quran. And one of the themes that's identified is that the Quran is directed, because it is believed to be the word of God in comparison to the other texts, that it's directed to speaking to man. And there, the cause of there is a reason for each revelation which the Muslims believe are for specific events, and there's the hermeneutics behind that and everything. So perhaps that could be a different dynamic, that it is speaking directly to the reader, and there is the kind of belief, whatever one's educational background or kind of familiarity with the Quran is, if they're a believer in the fact that it is the word of God, that from it they would somehow interpret something, and that it is accessible for people. So it could be, I mean, I think that idea of something floating.
And that in itself is a very interesting thing for some things we might come on to explore later in looking at later chapters in the book, about also how Gülen works with the Quran in terms of its contemporary speaking to people.
Okay, so going back to Gülen, one of the other questions that I had, and this is when I was reading the very early section on Gülen's life in Erzurum. So the interviews kind of focus a lot on informing the reader that Gülen observes a lot during this period, and his childhood and kind of early youth, on and of the role models around him, and he sees that the role models are somehow kind of personifying whatever value that is being discussed. So if the name of the Prophet is passed, his grandmother would cry, and there's that kind of a depth of emotion that he sees, and he familiarizes himself, perhaps socializes and grows and understands faith through that lens. When I was reading that, for me, it reminded me of Gülen's concepts of the pillars of Islam, and he says that whatever pillar it is, whether it's prayer or fasting during Ramadan, that one is to become prayer. So namaz lashmak, so to become prayer, or Ramazan lashmak, he uses to become Ramadan itself. So these sort of embodiments of the values. Of course, Erzurum was also a very orthodox place, and you kind of touch upon that in the text as well. Do you think it was these kind of very early times that had a profound impact on his kind of foundational understanding of Islam? I mean, I know you also touch upon other things that he experiences in his life in other places and other times which shape it, but do you think his early childhood is something that kind of profoundly puts the foundations for Gülen in his understanding of faith.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, certainly when I had the opportunity to meet and interview him myself, the role of such things was very clear, not just, so to speak, in the words that he said about it, but in the way that he spoke about those times and people. And I think the people thing is very significant, because, and that's why I spent some time around that. In a way, I know, a number of other texts have already covered some of that, and this kind of idea of a pattern about different eras that you can trace around different Izmir and then Istanbul and so on and so forth. I know that's a kind of a commonplace, but it's actually the role of significant, what I might call, significant individuals in all of that struck me quite strongly, and I think to me connects with some of the things, at least as I understand it and explored it later in the book, about, for example, the personages of the companions of the Prophet and so on, and the significance and role over and, well, not over and against, but certainly in terms of emphasis relative to other other aspects of Islamic tradition and inheritance. And that does, I think, and I thank you very much for the what you brought out about the becoming thing, because that's not in my text, and it's a thing that I need to reflect on. And I think it's a very insightful thing to emphasize that. And I think you're right in saying that, and I failed perhaps to pick up on that properly. And it's very interesting, this idea of embodiment. Might also say it's kind of interesting, not just as a kind of academic scientist, but also from a Christian believer perspective, because one might almost use, but carefully, the word incarnating here. Embodiment, that's what that means, and that one should, in that sense, aim or aspire to embody the virtues, the practices. It seems quite significant to me. So thank you for picking up on that. And it's interesting. But I think, yes, the role of personages, and then in other ways also in how Gülen articulates things that he sees as of particular importance, and wishes to communicate into these times, but also connected with other personages also in Islamic history. I think is a particular thing. I'm not saying it's a unique or anything, but I think it's something that one can see clearly.
I mean, I think it perhaps takes the Islamic values away from a sort of checklist that perhaps some Muslims have in their mind. It's like, do I pray 5 times a day? Tick, like, is it?
Yes.
Fine.
Yeah.
I think it adds a perhaps depth. Of course, that is a depth which would come from a more spiritual, perhaps Sufi kind of.
And it makes it very concrete and not abstract. I mean, in that sense, I mean, one can talk about such things abstractly, but when there is an embodiment of them, their power and their challenge and their inspirational quality is all the stronger, I think. Yeah.
I mean, for prayer especially, I mean, Gülen has touched upon it from very, very early on in his sermons till still recent. I mean, he doesn't do as sermons as often at all anymore. But I mean, I remember one of the messages which he released for the passing of one of his friends, one of the kind of early supporters of the Hizmet Yusuf Bek Masjid. And he said, he was one of the rare people who would pray. And for kind of a Muslim who would hear that, you'd assume that, well, the majority of people who call would pray. So what does it mean to be one of the rare people who pray? What is this kind of understanding of a depth to prayer? Is interesting. But yeah, not unique in itself. It's from a kind of more Sufi understanding of that. Okay, I mean, in that section, you also talk about how an introduction to the Nursi kind of circles, which Gülen goes along with a larger group and then ends up being the only person who remains. I mean, some sort of focus on science and modernity, or critiques of modernity, and perhaps trying to place Islam somewhere within modernity. That's something important. I mean, I read a lot of Gülen, but I had always come across and read his interfaith encounters as being something which perhaps began in his time in Istanbul, for example. But you trace it back to his time in Edirne, which I mean, I read a lot of his other biographies. It was kind of interesting, that he actually went and observed the Jewish community in prayer, or had encounters with the Baha'i community. Of course, that period, Edirne and Izmir, is kind of a period of visiting coffee houses, theatres, and for him, some time in prison.
And I think I wanted to bring that out a bit, because there can be, I think, a tendency to say that the engagement with what comes through other religious traditions and peoples comes only later, as the movement spreads wider into the world, or even is a kind of a pragmatic reaction to things like 9/11 and so on and so forth. When I learned about these, maybe fragile and fragmentary, as distinct from systematically developed contacts, when I learned about them, I thought, well, that's important, because that also, and the context in which they took place. So that's actually going and hearing the Psalms recited. So it's not a use of interreligious dialogue for pragmatic purposes, though it may have pragmatic benefits, but it roots it in some sense of commonality that the divine speaks in many and varied ways, as it puts it in the Christian scriptures and the letters of the Hebrews. God has spoken in many and varied ways to our fathers by the prophets. And well, I'm glad you picked up on that little bit that's in there, and also, of course, that context was itself maybe more, I mean, not in an enormous sense, but the fact that historically there was a very strong Jewish community there, and the great mosque and so on, but also the Baha'i, remains a very significant location for Baha'i people today. So yeah.
And I think the kind of cultural context, I mean, I should probably know off by heart, but I don't know of the dates of pogroms against the Jewish community. I know they took place in Istanbul, but I'm sure there was effect of that throughout Turkey at the time. So kind of tracing that and having a look at the timeline for me would be something interesting. And also, I mean, I think the interfaith encounters.
Otherwise, one can simply pop up and say, okay, in Istanbul, he started to
with the white collar individuals,
people and Jewish businessmen and big leaders, rabbi type people, etc. But again, this going and being present in what one might call, in social science terms, when one is researching, one talks about participant observation. I think that believers can have what one might call, participant respectful observation of another's way of worship, and that operates at a certain level. That's important to understand.
Because I was also thinking, I mean, it could just be intrigue from a religious perspective, and then there would be nothing wrong with it. It's just like you said, serving others in worship is that I assume there's nothing wrong with that. And yeah, so it was definitely interesting to see. I think this is probably one of the first times that I've noticed that that's been mentioned very early on, before the kind of Istanbul, the Journalist Foundation, and the iftars and everything, the major events that it has been mentioned, especially with the Jewish community, which I thought was interesting there. So yeah, my kind of previous question was about Gülen. Now I want to kind of have a look at the movement on the same kind of trajectory timeline. Which kind of period do you think is most significant for the movement? And I guess that's kind of an open-ended question, really. How do you define significance by terms of growth, or where it kind of cemented its foundations, or where it began its first projects? But isn't it Istanbul, or the more kind of global steps that the movement made? I mean, which area would you see as being most significant for the movement, and for what reason?
I mean, in some senses, it's difficult to tell, because, of course, one is always looking backwards, as distinct from how things must have seemed at the time. I'm not sure that, so to speak, at the time, in these earlier periods and locations, a movement was seen. There were initiatives that were taken that became wider and wider and inspired other kinds of initiatives. Both perhaps the self-understanding into something more than a set of initiatives, and then what the significance of that might be, either for the wider Turkish society and then beyond that, is something that only comes later. So, and precisely when this kind of transitioned from, what I've just referred to, I guess, as a set of interconnected initiatives, into something that became identifiable either by people within or by people without as something more solid, if you like. It's hard to say. Of course, there is always, external perceptions in, for example, Turkish society, I'm sure, started to create definitions upon these initiatives, maybe in an earlier sense than people themselves articulated their own self-understanding, because there's always this wish to, not just in Turkish society, but all societies, to understand a phenomenon, to categorize it, and to place it in a particular spectrum of things. The word significance, I guess, in many ways, obviously there was and has been, and in legacies terms still remains, a significance of the movement for Turkey itself. Insofar as significance then broadens itself, I guess not just the early connections and individual visits into European context, but I think particularly the transitions that took place following the end of the Soviet Union, and the opportunities that emerged within the Turkic former Soviet republics, the needs that were expressed there, the opportunities that emerged, the dynamic, and also perhaps at that point also very strongly the organizational capacities that were necessary in order to take that forward and transnationalize some of the early Turkish origins, even still within a Turkic inheritance. No, I'm rambling now, so I'll stop.
No, I was just thinking, and then it's most likely in those regions now, second, I doubt it would be third generation, but kind of second generation individuals who are kind of most likely leading the kind of Hizmet efforts in those countries. I'm doubting it's Turkish people who are in those kind of leadership positions in those countries. So that would then perhaps shake and shape the ways in which it is how it goes about. But in the book, you do touch upon the fact that it wasn't religious. It was more upon perhaps it followed the Turkish curriculum. So perhaps it was more nationalistic in that sense, which is something that the movement has a critique on itself of being nationalistic and kind of Turkish centered. I do think, I mean, there was the ease in the post kind of 9/11 era of the dialogue activities that were going on around the world to kind of use the Turkish identity, because it was seen as the only successful democracy in the Muslim world. Well, that didn't last or didn't go too well. And today it's on reverse, but the kind of Turkish identity was used both in kind of dialogue spheres and also, I mean, heavily in the US in dialogue spheres.
Yes, yeah.
In comparison to the US, less so in the UK, sorry.
Yeah, no, definitely.
The schools in post-Soviet area did have that dynamic as well. So there are, I guess, shifts there and things that still need to be observed in terms of changes and things, but it's a nice kind of area to just touch upon is as well. We do have a question that's just come through to me, and if anyone else who's watching has any questions and they'd like to ask, they can do so. But the question goes, for those inspired by, and this is quoting you, for those inspired by his teaching, for many wider observers, Gülen's teaching differentiates the rich traditional inheritance and spirituality of Islam from contemporary Islamism. Can you please elaborate on this a little bit more, is the question.
Okay. I mean, one of the strange things about, of course, all of these terminologies are problematic. One has to unpack. Islamism is bandied around in the media, and but one of the strange things is that that can be seen as being by modern non-Muslims as being traditionalist Islam, when in fact what it is, I would argue, is or what those strands, because there are many different strands of Islamism, are actually highly modernity affected ways of trying to develop Islam that often cut out, for example, centuries of traditional interpretation, and sometimes attempt kind of back to the Quran route, as if we could do that directly without any intermediary thing at all, or not benefit from that. And of course, alongside of that, the use of all the kind of modernity instruments that one finds. And I think my perception and understanding of Gülen is that he draws richly upon tradition without either being traditionalist in the sense of being purely repetitive of things, and thinking that by simply repeating, one guarantees authenticity. But it's also not what I think Islamism is, which is a kind of an attempt at a reinvention in relation to modernity. So I don't know whether I've said enough there, but it strikes me it's an interesting thing, and it's nothing against kind of people who are engineers or anything like that, but a number of people who've one can think of origins of the Muslim Brotherhood and so on. A number of the traditions come from people who were often actually secular scientists, technologists, or whatever, and have attempted to work against the background of the colonization of Islam and Muslims to create something that can, in a way, go back behind that, but also forward into modernity, but in a way that seems to skip over a lot of the richness in between from the Quran itself to the present day, in the attempt to do so, and to make this kind of almost direct line connection. And what I see with Gülen is something a lot more complex and multi-layered than that. So that's one part of the answer, and the other is, and apologies if I repeat myself here from the last session, but my understanding of Gülen's approach to the relationship between religion, state, and society, and that of what are often called Islamists, is fundamentally different, in that very often Islamists may be willing to use, and I mean in a proper sense, not abuse, but use the openings of democracy in order to attain a position of socio-religious power, and then as majorities think they can then carry through in appropriate, from their perspective, appropriate ways, how then, for example, Sharia law should be applicable throughout the whole of society and so on. My understanding and perception of Gülen is of something quite different. I know there are those who would charge that actually that's his real agenda underneath. And one always has to take seriously such critiques. Such things have happened. One only needs to look at contemporary Iran. Khomeini didn't come out of nowhere, and when he first went back to Iran, had a very different it was on a different trajectory than the one that then developed. It appeared, or it was part of a more complex scene. And so I know. There are also those who even draw that parallel with Gülen and say, well, if he did go back to, or at least in the past, that might have been more possible. I see no evidence of such a great disjuncture between what I can read in his explicit teachings that would lead me to think that in actuality there's a gap between that and what actually Islamists want to achieve. Yeah.
I mean, I would agree with what you said as kind of Islamism. I mean, there is some very vague kind of historical context and kind of intellectual efforts, but it's very minimal. I mean, it was never a predominant kind of trend within Islam throughout history. It's a kind of modern reaction which has gained attention and it grew through things like the Muslim Brotherhood or the impact of the Iranian Revolution. I think in itself it's tries, it is an attempt to be an alternative to whatever the impact of colonization was for the Muslim world. But I think it somehow steps on its own toes and kind of repeats the same notions by, I mean, it's a more kind of othering discourse, that of Islamism.
Yes, it's ironic. It's in a way, it's a challenge to hegemonic discourse and actual power politics, but which ends up creating its own mirror alternative to that.
I mean,
and this is where I think, Gülen does quite a lot speak about I'm paraphrasing there, don't develop Islam and your way of being Muslim as reactivity to something else, whatever that else is, and even if that else is really bad and has been really distressing and has been really destructive, if you develop something as a reaction, it's not, in the end, it's not going to be healthy or good, and actually can contain the seeds of its own destruction. So that, I think, is a very strong thing to me as well. It's not a reactivity that I perceive in. That's not to say that Gülen himself, I think, and in some of the earlier writings, one can see things that have a certain reactivity to Western cultural dominances and so on. But it still, to me, remains very clear that the fundamental project, so to speak, out of which he speaks and develops, is not one that is driven by reactivity. It's one that's driven by the attempt at, in the first instance, faithfulness to the Quran and the traditions.
And I think, there's just kind of a couple of things coming off my head at the moment. That one of the other things that you mentioned in this section is about metaphysic gelirim. So there being some sort of metaphysical power that motivates the individual. So something coming from the inside rather than something that's a reaction to something. It's something that's developed through a kind of spiritual honing of the values of altruism that makes people go above and beyond and kind of embody the values of Hizmet and service to others. So it's not reactive in the kind of Islamist sense, that it also others to others kind of make the Islamic faith superior in some sense, that it'll go back to the kind of golden era of Islamic history, but it's something more humble, I think, in that sense, if that's the right word to use,
and in a sense creative. Because the going back is in many ways it's a dead end. It's literally a dead end. The world is not as it was, whatever it was and whatever one thinks it was, and however from certain perspectives glorious or heroic, it isn't like that now. It's like something else. So one needs creativity combined with faithfulness, I think.
And I think inclusion as well. For Gülen, those who were in the West, he wouldn't have an issue with them participating or being active in any area of either the state or kind of whatever area that individual would want to participate as someone from that country. So, an Islamist, for example, may have issues with that in kind of theoretical. Can I pay tax to this country if they're released, for example, and kind of more complex questions like that. But I was just going to say on Islamism again, some just notes that I was making as we were talking. There are, of course, within it various strands. You have some more intellectual strands. You have socialist strands, like people like Ali Shariati, for example. There's also the kind of violent strands as well, which Gülen would be against in the fact that he is against violence in kind of Islamist terms. For self-protection, I doubt he would deny the right to protect oneself, but
Mm.
sort of ideological divide that understanding doesn't exist for him either, is kind of what I was thinking. So yeah, that was something very interesting for me. So thank you for the question. It kind of opened other discussion points. It is coming into our last kind of 15 minutes. So if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to ask, then they can either type it in the chat section on YouTube, and then I can kind of channel it into discussion. Or if anyone wants to kind of private message me, I can also channel that into the discussion as well. So we spoke about Gülen's life and the kind of trajectory of the movement separately a little, although they do kind of intertwine as well. Do you think it's best to, and I know this is kind of something we've spoken about before, but is it best to look at them separately, or is it best to look at them together? Is there a part where they part? I mean, I think not entirely part, because it's a movement inspired by the teachings of Gülen, but is there a point where things become, and I'm using words which kind of suggest my own opinion, where things become more localized in countries that the movement is active in? Is there a point where Gülen's influence is reduced, perhaps?
I mean, to some extent, I'd respond to this not in relation to the specificities of Gülen and of Hizmet, but to how things often develop in terms of religiously inspirational founder figures and movements that are inspired by them. I think one can learn a lot by looking at the history of religions and religious movements in this kind of way, in a comparative sense. And of course, in those, I think there is always, there's both a connection, but then there is, I think, an inevitability of a distinctive development that takes different shapes and forms, particularly in movements that become global. And that is inevitable, so as long as those movements are not cults. If they're cults, then they remain focused internally on just reproducing whatever it is that is the socialization of that group. If they are concerned really and actually do connect with the societies in which they operate, with all their distinctiveness as well, then they will start to develop in different ways. Then how far the sort of mutual communication and mutual shaping that we touched on in discussion before, and we'll come back to again, no doubt, as go through the book, between kind of Gülen's original teachings, attempts to put things into practice, questions that arise from those attempts that then go back to Gülen, and how far then that kind of, and how far he also says, well, actually, that's for you to work out, which is another mode that sometimes overlooked a bit, I think. But in a number of the interviews, that came through as being a response that's not, I almost made it sound like flippant. Well, that's for you to work out. I don't think it is meant to be flippant. I think it's meant to, it's a serious response in recognizing that there will be things that will develop. I mean, later in the book, I think I explore it in particular in relation to some discussion around the movement in the USA, which I don't claim to have particular insight into, in the sense I haven't researched it. But I mean, I think Gülen was saying things to the effect, well, people in the future in the USA will be dealing with things that I know nothing about, and they need to, develop in their own way. In a way, I'm paraphrasing now, but I think that was quite clear. Now, where the boundaries are around that, are there boundaries? Are those boundaries set, for example, by Gülen? Does he have a perception of what would be a legitimate development and what would be an illegitimate development? I have to admit, I don't think I directly explored that question with him in the interview, but that might be an interesting thing to explore with him. And on the part of people within the movement who then set, or perhaps think they can set boundaries, and who does that on what basis, that's another interesting and contestable question. I explore some of that a bit more, I think, in the other book, at least the European context. But it does also come up later in this book in exploring also, the future of Hizmet beyond Gülen and beyond Gülen's life. So those boundary questions will inevitably, I mean, I know they're there as debates within the movement now, and I suspect they become sharper, not necessarily sharper in the sense of unpleasant, but the issues and the questions become sharper as time goes on.
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of answers to your questions just as an insider spark as you was talking. So where if anyone does seeks or is given authority, perhaps other than Gülen within the movement, to answer some questions that is there. I mean, I think it is present. If you have the elder Argus, for example, or people who can also take upon that role. But it's also something that can be broken down as well. And I think there are challenges to that kind of generational differences and kind of plurality of understanding of Islam itself within the movement,
Yes.
Whether that's more conservative or more liberal approaches, and how they will inevitably on some issues they will clash in the very near future, I assume.
Yes, I mean, I think there are different ways of being respectful. And I guess in certain cultural mores and heritances, being respectful concerns holding back rather more. And in other cultural contexts, being respectful fully includes robust debate. In the other book, one of the things I explore a lot actually around the Netherlands is a society where very robust debate happens, and that's the way that you become at home in the Netherlands. And this was something I know in my interviews from the Netherlands, they explained historically when they were first trying to connect with Dutch society. They didn't understand this. And so they tried to present certain ways, historical ways of going about making contact with the wider society, and realized ultimately only later that in the Netherlands, the way you kind of make peace is by being quite disputive.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's in a societal setting, but I'm reflecting back on that. I think the relationship between individuals and how they perceive and relate to Fethullah Gülen can also have something of that. And there's a task probably to communicate between these two different understandings of respectfulness. Yeah.
And also, I think the setting is really important, and also the statement of kind of Hizmet values or principles, I think it was, from the Alliance and Shared Values. I mean, to what extent can an Islamic movement accept all of those with an Islamic precedent and in, say, the Western context? And I think that Gülen is sincere, in my personal opinion, in saying that those are the values or principles of the Hizmet movement, but for individual people to kind of see those and then compare that with religious texts in some places where things may seem to contrast or conflict, and where
and it's difficult because sometimes the attempt to translate can lead to a certain I'm trying to find the right word here, superficiality of connection with the particular societal context. So here I'll say something that I've said kind of in observation to colleagues and friends in the UK. So for a number of years, in some materials produced in the UK, you'd see, part of the working of our work is to do with social cohesion. Okay, well, social cohesion is a laudable thing, but it's also, the terminology is very time and place specific, and even political with a small p, or even a big party political, you find it more in some contexts than in others. So one understands what's trying to be communicated about that, why we should be concerned as Muslims with social cohesion. But if you try to translate the richness of the inheritance into this is all about, so you've lost an enormous dimension, you see. So this task of being connected and being sufficiently embodied, going back to that first discussion we had, in a place and time, but not in the process losing sight of what I think is, the particular contribution of Gülen, and having, like I said, worked with this very deep, long and rich sense of tradition in the proper sense of that word.
Well, thank you very much. It is 2 minutes to our time being up, so I think that was a nice way to wrap up, and I will not question you further on that chapter. Like I said, I mean, there were kind of very specific bits within the chapter that were very insightful for me, and through our discussion, other things that have come up as areas that I've made note of, that I find really interesting, and we'll hopefully think about. So thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you next week, hopefully.
Yes, I'll do my best not to get buried in book boxes again.
That's something we all sympathize with, so don't worry at all.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.